The beginning of a breaking point. Every classroom holds power. Sometimes it's in the lesson, sometimes it's in the teacher, but sometimes, when no one is watching, power hides in silence. This is the story of a classroom where silence became a weapon, where a teacher, trusted to enlighten, instead used history to divide, where a black girl, brilliant yet quiet, endured daily erasure behind a wall of subtle mockery, and where one unexpected voice stood up, shattered that silence, and exposed a truth too long ignored. This isn't just a story about racism in education, it's a story about reckoning, about resistance, about what happens when courage shows up in the middle of history class. And by the end, you'll understand exactly how Room 207, once ruled by quiet cruelty, was reclaimed by truth, and why Keynote 1 is no longer a warning, but a memory of what changed MS. Cartwright's classroom, Rain Ashwood High, was an ordinary school in an ordinary town, but in Room 207, history was taught with a slant sharper than the edge of MS. Cartwright's ruler, MS. Cartwright, had been teaching for over a decade. She wore crisp blouses and pearls like armor, and walked with the confidence of someone who believed every word she said was the gospel truth. Her smile was tight, her voice was sweet, but there was something venomous hidden beneath it, something that only certain students could feel. She didn't scream, she didn't curse. No, MS. Cartwright was more dangerous than that. Her weapon wasn't volume, it was tone. Her lectures danced between fact and bias, each comment laced with historical revision that tilted just enough to carry judgment, but never enough to provoke formal complaint. When she spoke about European history, her eyes lit up with admiration. But when the syllabus turned to Africa, the tone changed, detached, clinical, dismissive. When discussing the civil rights movement, she'd sigh and say, well, some people just like to cause trouble. No one corrected her. Why would they? Parents adored her, the principal defended her, and most students had learned that challenging MS. Cartwright meant extra homework, or worse, humiliation. She was the queen of subtle cuts, and her kingdom was silence. In her world, certain students, usually the quiet ones with brown skin or thick accents, were left out of the discussion entirely. She didn't call on them, she didn't quote them. She acted as if they didn't quite belong. And every time no one said anything, her power grew. Amira's quiet strength. Amira Jackson sat in the second row, third seat from the left, always early, always prepared, always silent. She was the kind of student who turned in her homework early, annotated her notes with precision, and read ahead, always. But despite her excellence, she rarely spoke in class. Not because she had nothing to say, but because experience had taught her that speaking didn't guarantee she'd be heard or respected. Her voice was gentle, her tone thoughtful, but her presence in Room 207 was treated as optional by MS. Cartwright, when Amira raised her hand, the teacher would glance past her as if she were part of the wallpaper. On the rare occasion she was called on, it was either to be corrected, mocked gently, or ignored outright. Still, Amira kept showing up. Every day she endured the subtle jabs, the historical erasures, the insinuations about her culture's lack of contribution. Every day she swallowed the sting of injustice and pressed her lips into a firm line. Because she knew something no one else seemed to understand. Survival is its own kind of resistance. She held Maya Angelou's "Still I Rise" like a silent prayer in her chest. She traced Langston Hughes' poems in the margins of her notebook. She carried the strength of 100 years of history in her bones. But Room 207 had a way of making even the strongest feel invisible. But strength, even when silent, is never gone. It just waits for the right moment to rise. And Amira's moment was coming. Targeted mockery, it was Thursday, gray skies above and a mood to match. The classroom buzzed with tired whispers as students filed into Room 207, unaware that today would change something. MS? Cartwright stood tall near the whiteboard, clutching her history textbook like a scepter. Today, she began with forced enthusiasm. We're talking about the civil rights movement and modern education outcomes. A few heads lifted. Amira's heart ticked faster. MS. Cartwright clicked her heels as she paced. Now, class, she said, why do you think some students, especially in certain communities, still struggle with basic reading levels? There it was. Loaded, intentional, she didn't say it outright, but everyone knew what she meant, and then her eyes landed on Amira, not by accident. Miss Jackson, she said with a cold smile, since you represent one of those underperforming demographics, perhaps you can enlighten us. The class went silent. No one moved. Even the class clown, Elijah, froze mid-doodle. Amira looked up slowly. Her throat dried. She had read 3 books last week. She had aced every test. She could quote Baldwin, recite Angelou, and diagram the Montgomery bus boycott from memory. But none of that mattered now, because this wasn't about knowledge. This was about humiliation. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. MS. Cartwright leaned against her desk, amused. Didn't think so. She said with a smirk, maybe next time, sweetheart, try reading the chapter. Laughter flickered, nervous, complicit, and it cut sharper than a scream. Amira stared at her notebook, blinking back heat from her eyes. She didn't cry. Not in front of them, but someone else. Someone in the back row had stopped laughing. Elijah's turning point, Elijah Reyes, was not the hero type. He was the jokester. The guy who rapped the periodic table for fun, drew cartoons of teachers with villain capes, and turned every essay into a meme-filled comedy sketch. Most assumed he didn't care, not about grades, not about rules. Definitely not about history, but that Thursday, something changed. He saw Amira shrink in her seat, saw the way she clenched her pencil, the way her shoulders hunched like she was bracing for a storm she couldn't escape. He saw the hurt and the injustice, and for the first time in his life, Elijah got angry, not the kind of angry that makes you lash out, the kind that makes you think. That night, while others scrolled TikTok or played Call of Duty, Elijah sat in his room in silence. Laptop open, notepad filled with scribbles, a growing fire in his chest. He began to dig. He pulled up studies on educational bias, articles about teachers with unconscious racism, data on how black students were undercredited and overpunished. He even found video interviews of students from schools just like Ashwood, describing how they were underestimated and dismissed. Then he remembered something else, his phone. He scrolled through past voice memos and classroom recordings he'd saved to help him remember homework assignments. One of them captured MS. Cartwright's voice perfectly, the quote, the mockery, crystal clear. He stared at the waveform, jaw clenched. This, he whispered, isn't gonna slide. By 2A. Elijah wasn't just angry. He was ready. He had facts. He had audio. He had a plan. And when morning came, Elijah Reyes, the kid no one expected, was going to walk into room 207 and burn that silence to the ground. A night of research. Elijah had never spent this much time on schoolwork in his life. His bedroom, usually a mess of snack wrappers and sneakers, had been transformed into a war room. Articles and statistics were open on every tab. His phone was plugged in, playing podcasts on racial bias in classrooms while he took notes like a man possessed. For once, his goofy nature took a backseat. His jokes were silent, his sketches forgotten, because now it was about something bigger than a grade, bigger than a joke. It was about Amira and every student who had ever been made to feel small. He couldn't forget the look in her eyes, that tight, wounded silence, the kind of silence that made you feel like speaking up was pointless. Elijah tapped his pen against the desk, eyes locked on the screen. He wasn't just collecting facts, he was collecting fire, a Harvard study on teacher bias, a district report showing the suspension rates of black students, testimonials from whistleblowers who had once worked in schools just like Ashwood. He found interviews, research papers, quotes that stung like truth and left no room for doubt. Then he remembered something important. People forget data, but they remember stories. So he crafted his message like a slam poem disguised as a PowerPoint. With rhythm, with edge, with truth, each slide a dagger, each quote a mirror, and at the center of it all Amira's silence, her dignity, her strength. By dawn his eyes were bloodshot and his hands were shaking. But the presentation was done. He zipped his hoodie, slipped his phone into his pocket, and whispered to himself, "Let's make history," in history class. The confrontation, it was supposed to be just another Friday. But the moment Elijah walked into room 207, something felt different. He wasn't slouched. He wasn't grinning. He didn't head to the back row to crack jokes or draw mustaches on textbooks. No, he walked straight to the front. MS Cartwright, already at the podium, gave him a puzzled smile. "Mr. Reyes, something you'd like to share?" "Yes," he said calmly, "I'd like to teach today's lesson." A wave of whispers rippled across the room. MS Cartwright tilted her head. "Excuse me." Elijah didn't flinch. "On behalf of the students, I have a presentation about systemic racism in education and about what happened yesterday to Amira." Time froze. Even Amira lifted her eyes, confused, unsure. MS Cartwright laughed nervously. "This isn't a talent show, Mr. Reyes. Take your seat." But Elijah's hands were already moving. Flash drive into the laptop. Projector screen lowering. The screen lit up with his title slide, "The Hidden Curriculum, What You're Not Being Taught About Racism in Schools." MS Cartwright's eyes narrowed. "Sit down." "No," Elijah said, voice steady. "You've spoken long enough. It's our turn now." And then he clicked the first slide. What followed wasn't a rant. It wasn't disrespectful. It wasn't chaos. It was precision. He quoted studies about implicit bias. He displayed charts showing how students of color were punished more harshly and praised less. He even pulled up voice clips, one of which was MS. Cartwright's mocking words from the day before, played for the entire class to hear. Her voice filled the room, loud and cold. "Didn't think so. Maybe next time, sweetheart, try reading the chapter." A pin could have dropped. Students stared. MS Cartwright's expression cracked. And Elijah kept going. He closed with a quote from James Baldwin, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Then he turned off the projector, looked her straight in the eye. "You tried to silence Amira," he said, "but you made all of us listen." Student reactions for a full 5 seconds after Elijah finished. The room remained frozen. You could hear the hum of the projector cooling down, the soft creak of a chair shifting, someone's breath catching in their throat. Then one student clapped, a single, sharp clap, and then another, and suddenly the room was alive. Applause broke out, not the slow, awkward kind, but real, thunderous clapping. Some students even stood. A few turned to look at MS Cartwright, then at Amira, their expressions finally awake to something they hadn't noticed, or hadn't dared admit. Reality was cracking open. MS Cartwright stood motionless, her posture stiff, her lips parted slightly as if she were still waiting to respond, but there was nothing left to say. The voice memo had done more than just expose her cruelty. It revealed her carefully veiled prejudice for what it truly was. Elijah turned and walked back to his desk. No swagger, no smirk, just quiet resolve. Amira stared at him, stunned, not because he defended her, but because he had seen her, really seen her, and the rest of the class. They began to shift. The silence that once protected MS Cartwright had shattered. Students who never said a word began whispering their own stories, about comments in the hallway, about being passed over in class, about feeling like they didn't quite belong. By lunchtime, the story was out of room 207. By final period, it had reached the main office. By nightfall, it was all over social media, and Amira's name wasn't a whisper anymore. Online uproar, it started with a student's post. Just a short clip, 30 seconds long, the voice recording, Elijah's closing quote, a caption that read, "Our teacher mocked a black student for being too quiet. This is how we responded." Within an hour, it had 1,000 views. By midnight, 50,000. By morning, it hit 100,000 and counting. Students across the district began sharing their own experiences. Hashtags exploded. #We stand with Amira, #classroom justice, #not in our school. Parents flooded the school's Facebook page. Alumni wrote emails to the board. Local journalists started calling. Some even showed up outside the school gates before homeroom the next day. Ashwood High, once just another quiet public school, had become the center of a growing storm. The principal issued a bland statement. "We are aware of the allegations and are investigating the matter." But no one was fooled. This wasn't just about one class. It was about a system that let a teacher like MS. Cartwright thrived for years, unchecked, unchallenged, unbothered. Inside the school, students wore black in solidarity with Amira. Others made posters quoting her poems and holding them high outside room 207. But room 207, it was locked. MS. Cartwright hadn't returned. Rumor said she was on administrative leave. Others whispered she'd lawyered up, but none of that really mattered now, because for the first time in years, no, maybe ever, students had taken back the narrative. Elijah, who never thought of himself as a leader, was now being called a hero, but he shook his head at that. "She's the hero," he said, nodding toward Amira in the lunchroom. "I just made sure the world heard her." Teacher resigns by the following Monday. Room 207 had a substitute. No explanation, no morning announcement, no final word from MS. Cartwright, just silence. But this silence felt different. This one came with consequence. Outside the classroom, a school board meeting had been called. Parents filled folding chairs and demanded accountability. Reporters scribbled every word, and tucked away in a quiet corner, Amira sat beside her mother, holding a small notepad, just in case they asked her to speak. They didn't, but her presence alone said more than enough. 3 days later, the school sent an email to all students and parents. MS. Cartwright has officially tendered her resignation. We thank her for her years of service and wish her the best in future endeavors. It was sanitized, neatly packaged, devoid of the truth, but nobody needed it spelled out because the truth had already gone viral. The truth had already echoed through hallways, homes, and hashtags. MS. Cartwright's resignation wasn't the end of a career. It was the end of a reign, and in its place, something new began to bloom. The students who had once sat in her class with heads down were now holding theirs high. The fear that once shadowed certain rows had lifted. You could feel it in the air, like something old had finally been exorcised from the school's bones, and at the center of that shift stood the girl she tried to break. A new beginning. Amira walked into room 207 again, but this time it felt different. Gone were the tight shoulders, the shrinking posture, the silence that had once felt like armor. She walked with certainty now, her steps steady, her eyes clear. The walls looked the same, but the room was no longer haunted. The substitute teacher greeted everyone with a warm smile and asked for volunteers to lead a group discussion on justice in history. Amira raised her hand, not hesitantly, not as a test, but because she wanted to speak. And this time, every eye turned to her, ready to listen. She spoke about redlining, about educational inequality, about how true history isn't always comfortable, but it's necessary. She quoted Author Lord and shared her own experiences, not with shame, but with power. And the class listened, really listened. Even Elijah, in the back row, gave her a proud nod, one that said, "You found your voice, and the world is finally hearing it." What happened in room 207 didn't just expose a single teacher's cruelty, it sparked a ripple. A movement, a reckoning. Diversity training was implemented school-wide. A student-led equity council was formed, and Amira, once overlooked, once silenced, was asked to join it. She did. Because for the first time, she saw the future not as something she had to survive, but as something she could shape. And so the girl who once trembled beneath mockery stood tall at the head of the classroom, no longer invisible. Because silence, when broken, becomes power, and power, when rooted in truth, can rewrite everything, even history. Full circle, a room rewritten. Room 207 didn't change overnight. The paint was the same. The chairs still squeaked, but the silence, that poisonous, heavy silence, was gone. What started as a quiet act of cruelty became a loud lesson in accountability, and the teacher who once twisted history became part of it. More importantly, the student once mocked for her quiet became the voice everyone now followed. What a mess! Cartwright, once ruled with fear and bias, is now a space led by truth and courage. The class didn't just learn about history, they made it, and Amira Jackson, she became a name no one would ever forget again. Because the reign of silence ended the moment one student stood up, and that, right there, is where the story circles back. To the start, to the moment silence seemed permanent, and to the day someone dared to break it. History isn't just written in books. Sometimes it's rewritten in a classroom.